Hey guys, it's Jihao here. So I know we just went through a very hard 2020 and we more or less have some hopes towards the coming 2021. And as my New Year's resolution, I would like to make some videos discussing my home country, China. And surprisingly, the first one I would like to make is actually how I became more patriotic after moving away from China. So I would like to start off this video by introducing you this drawing that I made last October right here in this apartment in Nice. And what's being depicted on this drawing is the defense of Sihang warehouse in my hometown Shanghai during the Second World War. So the battle took place in October 1937, which is a part of the 3-month-long Battle of Shanghai. So what happened back then was that China was already losing the Battle of Shanghai, and the Japanese army had occupied almost every piece of land north of the Suzhou Creek, which was the Chinese-controlled part of Shanghai back then, because to the south, it was the international settlement controlled by the Western nations. So basically, Sihang Warehouse was the only Chinese-occupied territory in the urban area of Shanghai, and the ROC government back then decided that it is important to show the international society China's resolution in resisting the Japanese invasion. So under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Xie Jingyuan, around 400 Chinese soldiers dug in inside the warehouse, and for 4 days, they fought back waves after waves of Japanese charges, and even though they were surrounded by Japanese forces, which almost outnumbered them 10-1, and they're known by the world eventually as the 800 heroes. But what's most remarkable about the 800 heroes was the fact that they inspired countless Shanghai citizens to cheer for them across the Suzhou River during the fight. And what's even more inspiring was the fact that they managed to raise a Chinese flag under heavy Japanese fire, making the symbol of hope and resistance during the darkest hours of Chinese history. Now, of course, I can make a whole video about the defense of Sihang Warehouse, and it's not the topic of today. But what I want to talk about now is why I decided to make this drawing last October, because after all, I've known this story since I was a child, so why didn't I make it earlier, while I was still in China? So of course, the direct reason was that in August 2020, the film The 800 was released in cinema, which is about the Battle of Sihang Warehouse. And also since the battle took place in October, I was thinking maybe it could be, a kind of commemoration to also finish the drawing in October. But most importantly, I feel like drawing it now, because I think it's a great part of a history that deserves to be remembered, just like how the Battle of Normandy and the Battle of Stalingrad are remembered by the world. So it seems that I somehow became more patriotic after I came to Europe. Now, as astonishing as it may sound to be, this is actually what happened to me. But I will say for everyone who's living abroad, away from their homeland, this change actually makes perfect sense. And in this video, I want to talk about 5 aspects which resulted in this change. So let's dig into it. So by cultural identity here, I'm talking about the cultural label of Chinese. And this is actually something you wouldn't really feel unless you're living in another country. So back in China, if someone meets me, what comes into your mind first is definitely not the phrase, he is a Chinese, but instead something else. So for example, he is from Shanghai, he lived in the US as a kid, he likes drawing, he speaks good English, stuff like that. Now that I'm in Europe, it's a completely different story, however, because now if someone meets me, one of the first questions they would ask is, where are you from? And also, if someone tries to describe me to other people, of course, they would also say I'm a Chinese guy. So what I want to say here is that my Chinese identity naturally becomes my most important label now that I'm living abroad. And also given the fact that China is a completely different world from Europe, it's natural that my Chinese identity would be emphasized. It is how people would naturally identify me, so what matters here is how I think about this identity. Now, as a natural human being, I wouldn't try to make myself living shame and disgrace every day, so it's quite natural that I start to rediscover the greatness of China, the greatness of its history and its culture, and therefore feeling proud of my cultural identity as a Chinese. And this is actually something I noticed already when I moved to the US with my family at the age of 8. So even in the society of children, cultural identity still plays an important role in defining who I am. Unfortunately, China is indeed a country with great history and culture, so whenever someone tells me how interested they are in China, it actually adds a bit more to my proudness as a Chinese. Now, of course, in the West, a lot of people still don't know much about China, and also there are a lot of misunderstandings and even biases towards China. So as a proud Chinese, I will keep on taking pride in my cultural identity and to let more people know about the fantastic story of China. So aside from the great culture and history, what China is like today is also something worth being proud of. So we are by far the world's second largest economy and also the second strongest military. We're leading the world in the development of the 5G technology, as well as having the most comprehensive industrial capacity in the world. Now, no matter how negatively you think about China, these are just some of the facts that you cannot deny. And also, notice the fact that China is still maintaining its development at a very fast speed. So it's very possible that in the next decades, China will replace US as the strongest nation in the world. Now, of course, these are just achievements from the national level. But what I want to say here is that even in my daily life back in China, the nation's development has brought me a lot of conveniences which are very hard for me to enjoy here in Europe. So for example, in China, we're very used to mobile payment because we have great apps like, for example, Alipay and WeChat Pay. So back in China, I'm quite used to, just go everywhere with my cell phone. Whereas here in Europe, I need to bring my wallet everywhere I go because in many places, they accept cash only. And speaking of shopping, you'll be surprised at how many convenience stores there are in China, and more importantly, they're all open on weekends. Whereas in Europe, a lot of shops are closed on weekends, especially in Germany where almost everything is closed on Sunday. So when it comes to shopping, you really need to plan everything beforehand, and this could be quite stressful sometimes. I can of course list hundreds of small details like this, but what's also important is the general cityscape of China. So here in Europe, most cities are quite small and they don't even have that many modern buildings. So often when I was walking the street here in Europe, I was thinking about the skylines of Shanghai, just how modern and gigantic they are. And it's not just Shanghai, but also any major Chinese cities. Beijing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, you name it. So I'm not trying to compare if the lifestyle in China is better than the lifestyle of Europe, because obviously I also enjoy living here in Europe. But what I want to say here is that the lifestyle in China is completely different from the lifestyle of Europe. And it's exactly because of such difference that made me feel proud of it. So if you first met me here in Europe, you would notice that, in general, I'm trying to show you a more positive side of China. But if you have met me a few years earlier, you will notice that I'm actually a quite different person. So as you can imagine, after receiving the democratic public school education in America when I was a kid, I would have a quite different way of seeing things compared with many ordinary Chinese young people who had never been abroad at that age. So for many years, I actually distinguished myself among my peers for being someone who's critical towards the society and system of China. And as a result, I do have a quite big admiration towards the Western society and system. But what I need to point out here is that when I mention the term Western, I do distinguish between the US and Europe. So I lived in the US for 3 years when I was a kid in a small town called Rochester Hills in Detroit. So in this sense, I would say I actually have a quite good understanding on what life really is like in the US. So back then, even though I still admire a lot of things about the US, I already realized that maybe I don't want to settle in the US for the rest of my life. And one of the most important reasons why I came to this conclusion is that I think the American society in general lacks cultural diversity. And therefore, the American society in general is less open-minded and less tolerant towards other cultures. And this is actually exactly why I became more and more interested in Europe, because on this small continent of Europe, it exists so many different countries and cultures. And thanks to the EU, we can travel freely inside Europe. So for me, once I came to Europe, I will have the chance to explore the whole continent and experience all the different cultures and countries in Europe. And as a result, I believe the people in Europe should be also really open-minded and very welcoming towards other cultures as well. So basically, if I would just go there, I will be able to find friends very easily and therefore live a comfortable life ever after. And this fancy towards Europe reached its peak in 2016 when me and my family took a trip to Europe. So we traveled in Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. The trip was amazing and I really enjoyed every moment of it. And also during this trip, I was convinced that also the quality of life in Europe is indeed as high as I've imagined. So after I came back to China, I was determined that I have to come to Europe because this might be the kind of paradise I've been searching for. And it's exactly because of this reason I'm here in Europe and sharing with you all the story of my life. So it has been over a year since I came to Europe and I never regretted my decision because the experience I had here, it changed me. And these changes would benefit me for the rest of my life. But meanwhile, I also noticed that my previous fantasies towards Europe is also gradually fading away as I'm living here. And today, I wouldn't look at Europe with the same admiration that I had before I came here, but instead, I'm able to look at it in a more equal way. Now, of course, I had a lot of great experiences here, and I do enjoy living in this culturally diverse European society. But gradually I also realized that life in Europe is not perfect, especially from the perspective of a foreigner. So for example, when it comes to education, last year when I'm studying psychology in Germany, I also questioned myself, why am I studying like this? Because while studying psychology in Germany, it seems like the aim of learning is to simply memorize everything instead of learning how to apply them in real life. So in this sense, the German education system is actually not as advanced and revolutionary as I've imagined. Actually, it doesn't even seem that fundamentally different from the Chinese education system, which I've been complaining about for my whole life. And about the quality of life. So before I came here, I had the impression that maybe all the houses in Europe, they should look historical from the outside and quite modern from the inside. Well, it turns out I was only half right. So for example, my apartment here in Nice, it does look quite classy and historical from the outside. But as you can see, the interior is quite broken and in fact, it doesn't even have a proper heating. So looking back now, it's actually quite unfair that I've been always complaining about flats in Shanghai for not being warm enough in winter. I mean, well, after all, they're at least modern, for example, like my flat back in Shanghai. And even speaking of open-mindedness, it also wasn't the same as I've imagined. Now, of course, I was really glad to meet a lot of wonderful people here from different cultural backgrounds. But gradually, I also came to realize that most people won't give you extra attention or interest just because you're from another culture. So again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's not good to live in Europe, but I want to say is that by actually living in Europe, it helped me break my illusions about Europe. So by understanding the advantages and disadvantages of living in Europe, it helped me to form a more objective view about Europe. And I think for me, the most important lesson here is that I realized that Europe is after all not the paradise I've been looking for. And in fact, maybe there is no such thing as a paradise in the world, because then every country has advantages and disadvantages of living there. And also by removing Europe from an idealized position, it also helped me to realize the advantages of living in China, which indeed helped me to form a more objective opinion on my home country of China. And indeed, when I look back at the magnificent skyscrapers and the convenient lifestyle of China, there's no reason to not be proud of it. So due to China's development nowadays, more and more people are concerned about it. They want to know more about this country, which is having an ever greater influence on their life every day. And since most people haven't actually got the chance to travel to China, they heavily rely on Western media to know about China. But of course, the Western media are notoriously known for loving to demonize China. So many people, after being exposed by the Western media for a very long time, they all ended up having a very negative opinion on China. So after receiving so much negative information about China, people would be naturally thinking, is China really this terrible? And therefore, when they actually got a chance to meet a Chinese person in their daily life, they would naturally try to seek confirmation from this Chinese person. So in this sense, my attitude and behavior is actually something that matters a lot, because in this sense, I'm representing not only myself, but also the people of China, and as well as the nation of China itself. So you can say that every Chinese living abroad, including me, is like an unofficial ambassador of China in our own sphere of life. So for example, I'm the only student at the psychology faculty of Uni Freiburg in Germany, and I also believe that for most of my classmates, I'm the first Chinese person they've ever spoken to. So in this sense, I'm actually like the Chinese ambassador at the psychology faculty of Uni Freiburg. And this is why you might know me as a chilling and open-minded person, because for me, I think it's not just my personality, it's also my responsibility. Now, let's say if I act like a jerk all the time, then you will probably come to the conclusion that the Chinese people in general are strange, and probably there's some serious problem with this nation. And since most people in the West don't actually care to listen to the official Chinese press conferences, then as an overseas Chinese, our effort is actually crucial in promoting the image of China to the world. But of course, not every Chinese living abroad is aware of this responsibility. And a quite negative example would be this girl named Yang Shuping. So Shuping is a Chinese student studying at the University of Maryland, and she became famous after giving a controversial speech at the graduation ceremony in 2017. And the most controversial part of the speech is here, quote, "When I took my first breath of American air, I put my mask away. The air was so sweet and fresh, and oddly luxurious. I was surprised by this. I grew up in a city in China where I had to wear a face mask every time I went outside, otherwise I might get sick," unquote. So I have to say this is a quite lousy exaggeration of the fact, because honestly, I didn't remember the air in the US to be sweet. And what's more bizarre is that the fact that she actually landed in Dallas, which is actually one of the most polluted cities in the US, and meanwhile, Shuping's hometown in China, Kunming, is the city with the third best air quality in China. So I think what's really dangerous here is that Xu Ping somehow managed to strengthen the impression of the Western audience's fear towards China, that China is like a living hell for people, because the Western media has been trying to blame China for decades for polluting the environment, and the intention behind this is to try to convince the world that China is somehow trying to destroy the planet. And thanks to Xu Ping, the world only remembered the pollution in China, but not the beautiful nature in China, just like Kunming, her hometown. The world would also neglect the fact that China has tried so hard to revegetate the massive desert areas in the country, as well as China's effort to replace fossil fuels with renewable energies. But these are exactly the things that the Western media are unwilling to report on, and these are exactly what Xu Ping should be promoting, so the world can view China in a more objective way. Now, as a free individual, Xu Ping has the right to do whatever she wants, but I do believe that her intention was to actually gain respect from an American audience by complimenting America and complying with the American stereotypes on China. But again, I believe this is also a very lousy strategy, because I never believed that compliance can bring you respect from people. I mean, think about it. If you are unable to respect yourself, your nation, your own culture, I can't expect anyone to actually, pay respect to you. And this is why I would never comply when I'm faced with biased criticisms towards China. I would defend China's reputation, because after all, in a democratic society, you need to have different voices. And since in a Western society, the voice usually comes from criticism, so I would love to be the different voice in the Western society to promote the positive image of China. So looking back at the year 2020, I believe everyone would agree that it's a very hard year as the world was hit by the coronavirus pandemic. As the first country to experience the outbreak, China's response distinguished itself among the whole world. And for us Chinese people, this is really a year that boosted our confidence. So back in January, when Wuhan announced the lockdown, I was praying that China could make it through this hard time. Back in these days, we experienced a lot of fear and chaos within the country because we don't know much about the virus and somehow we don't know what to do with it. And externally, China, as well as the Chinese people, faced racial discrimination and political accusations simply because of the outbreak. So at that time, the situation was desperate and I had no idea how much damage the coronavirus is going to do to China. But deep inside, I had hopes for the country still. Because we have made it through the SARS pandemic in 2001 and also the great Wenchuan earthquake back in 2008. And I believe this time, with the joint effort of the whole nation, we will make it through once again. And indeed, resources began to pour into Wuhan from all over the country. Medical personnel arrived in Wuhan one plane after another. And within a matter of days, 2 new hospitals were built, and many other public places were transformed into field hospitals. But what impressed me the most was the solidarity that the country displayed while fighting this pandemic. Essential workers like policemen and deliverymen stayed in their positions despite the risk of catching the virus. But more importantly, the whole nation followed strictly the medical guidelines from the government and willingly stayed at home for 2 months. This of course included my family as well, even though Shanghai wasn't really affected by the virus. And here I would like to especially mention my 13-year-old brother. He is like the most active child you can see in your life, and yet he stayed at home for months without any complaints. Then in April, Wuhan lifted the lockdown, and life went back to normal in China. As China recovers from the coronavirus, we set off to help the rest of the world to fight against the pandemic. We supplied the world with masks and ventilators, as well as sending medical teams to European countries like Italy and the UK, and even sending vaccines to many countries. Now the pandemic might still be going on in the world, but China has never stopped its development. Amidst the pandemic, we landed Chang'e 5 lunar probe on the dark side of the moon and made technological breakthrough in the Tokmak artificial sun. But there's something more than technology. China also signed the RCEP agreement with 15 Asian Pacific countries and the bilateral investment treaty with the EU. And with this achievement, it could be assumed that in the next decade, the continents of Asia, Europe, and Oceania will be connected together and boost the development of the whole world. Now, I used to have doubts whether my country is developing on the right track. But looking back at 2020, China's resilience has cleared my doubts. I do believe that this trend of rapid development will progress into the 2021 and beyond. And with all that we've went through, and all that we will go through in the future, there's no reason for me to not be proud of China. Now I hope you enjoyed this video and that this video somehow helped you to refresh your impression on China. So I would like to make more videos about China and to discover this country deeper with you. And before then, stay tuned and Happy New Year.